Here's our data set, and it contains 3 tables of data, one for the sales transactions, customers, and products. In the sales transaction data, click anywhere in the data table and select Insert, Pivot Table. Leave everything as default except check the Add this data to the data model box and click OK. It creates the pivot table, and I'm going to select All, and you'll notice that all 3 of those data tables are added to this data model. Let's create our first pivot table. Under Products, I'm going to take Product Description and put it into rows. And then for values, I'm going to go to Sales Transactions and take Sales Order Quantity Sold and put it in Values. Now let's make a chart. Place your cursor in the pivot table, click on Pivot Table Analyze, Pivot Chart, and we're going to select the clustered column chart, the default. Let's rename the chart, double-click in the title, and let's put Total Cases Sold by Product. Let's also add some Y and X axis labels. Clicking in the chart, I'm going to select Design, Add Chart Element, Axis Titles. I want both primary vertical and primary horizontal. And I'll adjust those axis titles as well. This is the beer type, and the vertical is number of cases. To make this chart easier to read, let's rename this sum of sales order quantity. Back to the field settings, I'm going to select Pivot Chart Analyze, click on the Field Settings List button, and then down in the Pivot Chart options, I'm going to select Sum of Sales Order Quantity, Value Field Settings. I can now select a custom name, and I'm going to choose Cases Sold. So notice it changes on the pivot table as well as the pivot chart, and it's a little easier to read. Let's create another pivot table and pivot chart. To do this easily, select and copy with Control-C that first pivot chart, and then go ahead and paste it anywhere below. In this new pivot table, let's edit the field in value sections to reflect the count of sales order ID. So I'm going to take this out and instead drag sales order ID from sales transactions down into values. And instead of summing the order IDs, we want to simply count them. So click on the down arrow and select Value Field Settings for Sum of Sales Order ID, and then select Count instead of Sum, the default. For this pivot table, we also want to add a pivot chart. So click anywhere in that second pivot table, click on Pivot Table Analyze, and Pivot Chart. We'll select another clustered column chart. I'm going to change the title to Number of Sales Order by Product. And similar to the other one, let's add axis titles. Click on the chart, click on Design, Add Chart Element, Axis Titles, Primary, and Vertical. And then we'll label those. The beer type, and the count. Again, to make this easier to read, instead of having it say count of sales underscore order underscore ID, let's adjust that field option. Click on Pivot Chart Analyze, click on the field list again, and then let's adjust count of sales order ID with the down arrow, value field settings, and let's just change that to something simpler, like sales orders. Okay, let's make one more pivot table. So I'm going to copy either one, the first or the second one, and then paste it a few rows below. And we'll adjust this pivot chart as follows. I'm going to remove the current field settings and then add in sales order date in rows. And let's move the automatic hierarchy so that it's just sales order date. Then I want sales order ID and values. Again, I want to change this to count instead of sum. And then sales order quantity sold, also in values. And that I can leave as the sum. So I'm looking at on each day how many sales we made and how much was sold within each of those sales. Let's make a pivot chart from this. So click on this pivot table analyze, and pivot chart. For this one, we want to select a line chart and we'll go with the default. Make it a little bigger. Just like the other ones, let's make this one look a little more professional and clean. I'm going to start by changing count of sales order ID to sales orders. And let's change sum of sales order to cases sold. Let's also add access titles for this one. Under the design, add chart element. Let's add access titles, primary vertical and primary horizontal. The horizontal is the date, and the vertical axis is count. Let's also add a title to this one. We'll add it above the chart. And let's call it number of sales orders and cases sold by date. Now let's add some slicers. Click any of these three pivot charts. Under the Analyze, I'm going to select Insert Slicer. And we're going to insert two slicers. Select All, and then select Customer State and Product Description. Click OK. Our two slicers are created. And I'm going to rearrange my dashboard so I can see everything in one screen. So I've rearranged it into a user-friendly dashboard where the two bar charts are up top and the line chart is at the bottom. And I want the customer slicer up top, product description slicer below. Right-click on the customer state slicer and then click on Report Connections. We want to make sure this slicer is connected to all three pivot tables and pivot charts that we've created. So put a checkbox next to those. This will be our dashboard level slicer. We'll repeat the same thing for the product description slicer, although this one will only be a report level slicer. So let's just have it connected to the line chart, which is pivot table number 3 in my case. Let's also rename these so they're a little more understandable. For the customer state one, I'm going to right click and then select Slicer Settings. And then under Caption is where I change the name. We'll call it Dashboard Level Filter State. And I'll make it a little wider. I don't care if I cover up the table because the charts are what I really want to see. And let's rename this one. Right click, select Slicer Settings. Under Caption, we'll rename this one Report Level Filter by Product. And I'll also make that one wider. So dashboards serve the purpose of sharing a story by providing information in an easy to use and professional format for decision making. Understanding how the slicers work with the dashboard is important so that you can show the functionality to other users. So let's practice using the slicers to work with the dashboard. Let's click on Iowa, the dashboard level filter, state slicer, to see how each pivot table and pivot chart reacts. Okay, so now all of the results are filtered by the Iowa state. We can clear the filter by checking this button here, clear filter, and it auto selects everything again. Now click on Imperial Stout in the report level filter. Only the third pivot table and pivot chart should react, which is what we set it up for. To clear this, click on the little X next to the filter button. You can also make multiple selections by selecting one state, holding the control key, and then selecting a second option. Let's move on to the assessment questions. Which settings do you adjust to specify which pivot tables interact with the slicer? That was the report connections setting. Which settings do you adjust to change the heading or the caption of a slicer? To do that, we use the slicer setting. How many different types of beer were sold in Arkansas? To easily find that information, let's go ahead and click on Arkansas. Looking at the results, it looks like all 5 types of beer were sold in Arkansas. Which beer type had the highest number of cases sold in Arkansas? I'm already filtered on Arkansas, so I can leave it like that. And then I'm looking at the highest number of cases sold, which in this case is IPA. On which day did Slante sell the largest number of cases for Imperial IPA across all states? So across all states, I want to clear out just Arkansas and select all states. But we're just interested in the Imperial IPA product. So I'm going to filter Imperial IPA and then look at which day did we sell the largest number of cases. That would be April 13th, 2026.